of the 67th Annual Conference on World Affairs 5-day marathon. So I'll briefly sketch out some ground rules. Each speaker will have 10 to 12 minutes for their remarks, after which they may want to comment on what other panelists have said, and we should then have half an hour or more for questions. Succinct, well-constructed questions from the audience. Students will be given preference during question time, so please let them come to the front of the line. Also, now's the time to silence your devices. We want to hear every word our distinguished panelists can offer. First to speak will be Mickey Edwards, to my left, who taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government for 11 years, at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, and now heads the Aspen Institute's program for elected government officials. Mr. Edwards was also an 8-term congressman from Oklahoma, back when legislators actually tried to solve our nation's problems and politics stopped at the water's edge. The second speaker will be Janet Breslin-Smith, a specialist in national security strategy, who was the first woman to chair the Department of National Security Studies at the National Defense University. More recently, Dr. Breslin-Smith spent 4 years working with and learning from Saudi Arabian women during her husband's term as U.S. ambassador to the kingdom. Third, Dr. Jay Parker is chair of the Department of International Security Studies at the National Defense University. He has taught numerous university courses, among them film and foreign policy and politics and film at Georgetown and at West Point. A warning, if you try to Google Jay Parker, you will be swamped with lurid information about another Jay Parker, which begins with Jay Parker shows his past as a mind control sex slave. This is not that Jay Parker. And fourth is a substitution for Tammy Schultz. Sanho Tree, a multi-year veteran of the conference and a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He has directed the Drug Policy Project for many years. We in Colorado owe him a considerable debt for laying the groundwork for a more sensible drug policy in our state. And now, Mickey Edwards.
Jay, I know Jay, and he's great, and I hope nobody's there saying, why don't we have the other Jay Parker here?
I have had some embarrassing moments at conferences.
So just to let you in on the secret of how we do this and all of the careful preparation and planning. Now, there's a lot of preparation and planning for the people who put this on, but for those of us on the panel, we met a couple of minutes ago and we said, well, who's going to go first? I had walked out of the room for a minute. so I'm that, and that's kind of how we do it. And the thing you need to start with is, I guess, a glossary about the terms that we use. We did this. I was on a panel this morning, first panel, where the topic was, Barack Obama has regained his mojo, and we're also okay. What do we mean by mojo? Do we have a common definition? So I guess part of that is, what do we mean by exceptionalism? And so let me lay out my perception of what we mean when we talk about American exceptionalism. And I will say, and I'll tie it into what my definition is, but first tell you I am an avid, firm, devout believer in American exceptionalism. I believe we are exceptional, and I'll tell you why. Now, there are people who think that when you say that, what that means is you think Americans are smarter than other people. You think Americans are more moral than other people. You think Americans are well, I've started to say, better basketball players. That may not be true all the time. But, that this means we're just better people. That's nonsense. It's nonsense. We're not. We're not any better, smarter, wiser, more moral than people in any other country on the planet. That's not what makes us exceptional. What makes us exceptional is the way we govern ourselves. And that's what we're going to talk into, are we losing it? And are we starting to have a problem there? What made America exceptional was when the founders came over here and said, unlike what has been the custom in the countries that we were accustomed to before, where basically it was either the church or the king who called the shots, and the way you survived was not crossing the king or the church. But we're going to set up a system where the people are in charge. And that's why, I mean, this will be a big shock, I know, to a lot of you. I've served in Congress a long time, so I come with a congressional point of view. But if you were asking most people out on the street, who's the head of government in the United States, they would say Barack Obama, or they would have said George W. Bush or Bill Clinton. But of course, that's nonsense. The reason it's nonsense is because there's no head of government in the United States. There's separate, independent, equal branches of government. And most of the power in the government is in the Congress of the United States, not in the White House. And the reason is because the decision was made by the founders that we were going to set up the system that best allowed the people themselves to keep control of the system. The laws would be made by the people they chose. We would go to war when the American people, through their representatives, decided it was worth going to war for and not otherwise. And all those kinds of things that laid out how America was going to be different. We were going to be a self-governing democracy in which the final word rested with the people. And there are no lawmakers in this country who weren't elected by the people themselves from their own. There's a provision in the Constitution that every single senator and representative must be an actual inhabitant of the state from which they're elected. The idea is the people who are making the laws are people they know you, they know your interests, and so forth. So that's when I say I believe in American exceptionalism, it is the idea that it's not a king, it's not a church ruling us, it is the American people as a group in a democracy deciding, how we're going to be governed, what we're going to do. Now, why is it then appropriate to look at it and say, are we at the end of American exceptionalism? We have set up political systems, this is not constitutional system, political systems, in which small groups of people, whether it's the super rich or the super ideological, who take part in the primaries. Most people don't know this. In 46 states, the law is, including Colorado, the law is that if you have a primary election and a small group of people turn out in the primary, maybe 1/10 of 1%, let's say it's a Republican, 1/10 of 1% of the population chooses A, but B would have easily won statewide. B is much more popular, but B lost to that little 1/10 of 1% of super ideologues in the primary. The other candidate's not even allowed to be on the ballot. And I could start naming members of the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives who are in office today making laws because we have set up a political system that undercuts American democracy, both through the money and through the emphasis on letting parties control who can be on the ballot, what our congressional districts look like, and so forth. So that's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, because I'm guessing there aren't a whole bunch of you in here who are going to stand up and say, what are you, nuts? Our political system works beautifully. It's probably not going to happen. But there are other elements. And my wife's sitting here, and she pointed out, people say, well, be positive. We don't want to hear any negative. I'm going to say something negative. It is easy to point fingers at people in government, state legislatures, Congress, and say, what's wrong with those people? Why are we only electing stupid people? And, of course, I love it when people say, it's not nearly as good as when I was there. But the fact of the matter is that it's not the people. Most of the people, you can't tell this by looking at me, but I still work out in the House gym, and I see members of Congress. They're good people, smart people. They want to do the right thing, and they're trapped in this political system, that punishes you if you say you're willing to compromise, that punishes you if you say you're willing to cooperate and work across the aisle. But there's another problem, and let me conclude with this: a little bit of self-examination. And I realize, the ceiling is going to fall. I will never be invited back. And I know I'm on a college campus. But we have done ourselves great harm in that we no longer do a good job of training people to be citizens, to participate, to understand critical thinking, to question things, to be able to, we don't teach humanities anymore, the things that make you real people, the arts, music, the things that we've turned I'm a graduate of this, we've turned our schools, our universities, our finest universities into vote-tech schools. They're all about how you can become a player in the world economy. And that's great. We all need to be able to get a job. I have a degree in law. I have a degree in journalism. That's VOTEC. But we are not teaching people what is the value of democracy. What's the value of a system that honors women, that has rule of law, that does, it's not democracy, it's liberal democracy. That's what we believe in. And we are losing that. People are not learning that. And why don't they go vote? Why would they? The choices have been narrowed for them. They're dominated by a few forces, and they haven't really learned what it is that we're supposed to be out there protecting. So I'll stop there. I'm a believer in American exceptionalism as it was meant to be, a new system, no king. We're gonna govern ourselves. We're gonna make the rules ourselves, and we are in danger of losing it. And part of the reason we are in danger of losing it is non-participation, non-engagement, and not teaching people in our schools, how to protect and defend the kinds of democracy that we were intended to have. It's a fragile thing, and we can't do it just by sending emails to each other.
That was a great statement, I'm going to end kind of where Congressman Edwards ended. But first off, I should say, it's great to be back in Boulder. Our daughter went here to college, and it's lovely to be back on campus. For 4 years, I lived in a nation with a king. And one of the advantages that I had in doing that, and I think all of you who have lived overseas at all, it helps you reflect on the system of government we have, and it lets you have a taste of what it's like to live in another system. So my comments today are a little bit about this. What is it like living under a king? And how did we look to them? Certainly when I grew up in this country, I embraced the idea of exceptionalism. I love our country, and I loved everything about it. And the older I got, the more I loved it. I worked on the Hill for 17 years in that golden era where Republicans and Democrats worked together. I love Article I of the Constitution. And so I grew up with this sense of warmth about our exceptionalism, about our nation, and about Western values. So individualism, freedom, liberty, openness, all the things that come to mind probably to all of us on what that means to us. So honestly, it was a shock when I came to Saudi Arabia to hear Western values be referred to in a very negative way, as a dangerous thing and as a negative thing. And as I reflected on this in the 4 years, we were there almost 5 years, I tried to think through what was my image, what did this mean? And I realized that some of the words and some of the concepts that we embrace are perceived of differently. And I'll give you some examples. Individualism. I love that idea. But in the context of a culture that really, really venerates family and tribe and communal affiliation, I realized that they saw us as cold and heartless. And when I would ask about this, their number one example was assisted care facilities. That in most nations of the world, and certainly in the Middle East, and as I get older, I like this idea more, you live with your children, right? You families live together. And so the idea that we would, from their point of view, warehouse our elders in assisted care facilities was an example of an individualism in their mind of selfishness, of just looking out for yourself, and you put the elders away someplace. So I began to see that the words that had a meaning to me were having a different meaning to them, and the concepts are having a different meaning. Another one is openness. We live in a very open society. I embrace this. I worked on the Hill. Goodness knows we were about trying to explain ourselves to people and get that level of participation you're talking about. Again, in a culture that's much more private, where you lived behind walls, where the desert is a very threatening place in a very hot environment, lots of sandstorms. It's a different atmosphere. Saudi homes have very small windows. And I know when they would come into the residence in Riyadh, the first thing they noticed was we had floor-to-glass ceiling. We had a very open house. And in some respects, I realized we were symbolizing that openness. And in their houses, it's a much more a sense of privacy, of keeping things close. So some of the ways, as I looked at this, I realized I had the experience in the last 4 years of living in a country that also considered itself exceptional. It's the home of the two holy mosques. It's the birthplace of Islam. They very much protect their culture. They push back on their culture. When I go to Saudi Arabia, I have to wear an abaya. All people do. I cannot drive a car. No women can. And as an American, it was useful, I thought, to experience what a concept of exceptionalism feels like when you're at the other end, when you're receiving it. It hasn't changed how I feel about the United States. I realize in reflecting on this how unique we are given who we are. And as I was explaining this to Saudis, one of the things that caught my attention about this, in the world, China, Latin America, Africa, one thing that really is so reflective of us is that we are a nation of people who left homes and came here. Most Saudis don't leave. The kids who come here to go to college, they go home. In Latin America, most of my friends that I lived in Chile for a while, they stay. Even in Europe, there's a strong identification. You're German and you're going to stay, certainly in China. The idea that our grouping came from other places and that we embrace this idea, if you lose your job, move some other place. Again, from a Saudi point of view, we seem heartless about this issue. You make people move around, away from your family, away from this close connectedness. And I want to just kind of conclude with comments that Congressman Edwards made. Given that fact of who we are, how we came here, I want to underscore what he said about having an appreciation for how unique we are in the world, and that the idea that brings us together, those ideas, those Western values, liberty, freedom, participation, government that comes from the people, power that comes from the people, it is an idea. It's not an idea that happens very often in the world. In some respects, it's an idea that needs to be protected and nourished. And so, yes, I do see for ourselves the idea that we are exceptional for ourselves, and that that idea needs to be nurtured. I also see, from living overseas so much of my life, that what I used to assume is that this idea will be embraced around the world. That because I like it, they will not also like it, but they will want to be like us. And the experience of living in Saudi, as well as in Asia, as well as in Latin America, made me reflect about that. That our own ability to satisfy ourselves could potentially inspire in other nations a self-reflection for themselves. But we are truly, truly unique in the fact that people who come here came from someplace else. And so the idea of keeping that idea alive is something that requires our attention. So we're not supporting a king or a military dictator or some other strong authority structure. We come from a government or a culture that supports power coming from below. Later on in Q's and A's, and when we talk, we can kind of talk about this a bit. But there is nothing like, and those of you who have the students that are here, who have the opportunity to live overseas, I really, really recommend it as a chance not just to have that cultural experience, but to reflect on our own. Thanks so much.
Well, as Mickey alluded to, we got together before this and said, well, what are you going to say? I don't know. What are you going to say? There's a shall we say, a common thread that will at least run through the first three here. Let me start, as I always must, by issuing the disclaimer that the opinions expressed by me are my own and do not represent those of the United States government or any agency of the U.S. government, but You all have heard me before, and you know that. Let me begin by saying that I also believe that America is exceptional, that it's exceptional for many, many reasons, and that these reasons are things that warrant celebration and defense. However, I'm mindful of the famous quote by Karl Schurz, who some of you know, a German immigrant, a genuine hero during the American Civil War, one of the founders, early key figures in the American Republican Party, who once said, "Our country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right." Another variation on that by G.K. Chesterton, who was a famous British author and sometime gadfly, who once said, "My country, right or wrong, is a thing that no thinking patriot would actually say. It's like saying my mother, drunk or sober." So, with apologies to my mother, let me kind of highlight my perspective, the points I want to kind of raise about this, about the dangers of exceptionalism. And there are clear dangers. And I'm not just talking about the dangers of exceptionalism where we are highlighting or heralding exceptional points, and wrongly so, but even in those situations where we have set ourselves up to be and have convinced others that we are exceptional. And I'll focus first on the issue of foreign policy and security, my general field. One of the problems with American exceptionalism is that once you accept it, it becomes extremely dangerous. It becomes very dangerous to the nation itself for two kind of general reasons. One is that if others accept or believe that you are truly the exceptional nation that you say you are, then you become the default solution to every problem, to include those problems that you cannot and arguably should not solve. I think one of the greatest representations I saw of this was as the first group of my students from my time at West Point began to come back from Iraq, and at the time that the things were quite frankly falling apart, particularly with reestablishing governance and the infrastructure and essential services. Over and over again, they would say they would have conversations with Iraqis who, not saying out of cynicism or sarcasm or irony, but out of a genuine belief that we were exceptional and we were there because we were exceptional. The conversation would take on some variation of, wait a minute, you're the nation that could go to the moon. Why can't we, fill in the blank, have electricity more than 4 hours a day? Why can't you figure out a way for us to have water that's safe to drink? Why isn't it safe for us to live in our own neighborhoods and communities that even under a dictatorship we could at least walk down the street? The second danger is that you then you also make yourself a target to those who do not accept, whether for cultural reasons or ideological reasons, or for just the dynamics of global power and how it balances and shifts, by establishing yourself and attempting to convince others, and more dangerously, convincing yourself that you are exceptional, that you can operate beyond norms, treaties, obligations, risks that other nations all accept that they must take as part of the community of nations. You immediately become dangerously vulnerable. One of the other problems that I've noted with exceptionalism, and kind of to dovetail off of what Janet was saying, when you see this, in my experience, particularly when you are working with individuals who are dealing with other countries and other cultures, exceptionalism will very quickly blind you to what are the aspects of exceptionalism in other nations and other societies, whether good or bad, whether you are quick to disregard or discount positive, truly exceptional elements of other nations and cultures you are dealing with, or blind to exceptional elements that are exceptional for all the most dangerous reasons. One of the problems that I think ultimately this comes from, or comes down to, is from the standpoint of internal domestic governance, and this is just my perspective on what has happened to our democracy, is it has the potential to make real that one danger that critics of participatory democracy always hold up, that participatory democracy has within it the risk of being a mutual suicide pact, that the history of democratic nations that have held themselves up as exceptional and operating beyond not only the accepted values and norms of the world, but beyond the values and norms and beliefs upon which they were founded, do not last long. You can go all the way back to Athens in the 4th century and work your way forward and find example after example. So in the end, as I said at the beginning, I don't have any problem with saying I believe America is exceptional, and believing that and living it through my professional life for several decades. But to me, one of the most important things that I believe is part of American exceptionalism that should be celebrated and defended is the responsibility to recognize that there are times when this truly exceptional nation will be wrong, and that citizens must work together to set it aright.
Wow, I was hoping to find more things to disagree with, but these have been really good presentations, and I think Congressman Edwards made a very good, gave a very balanced definition of exceptionalism, as I think thoughtful people would like to use it. I'm going to talk about exceptionalism the way Fox News would use it. We're number one in that sense, and I think that's American exceptionalism in that sense has a Greek cousin. His name is hubris. The entire history of the United States of America could be condensed and tucked into an obscure Chinese dynasty or a footnote of that dynasty. The same can be said of India or Persia or any of these ancient empires with long recorded histories. And we don't know anything about them for the most part as Americans. I doubt most Americans can name one Chinese dynasty, let alone all the ones that have existed, and the prosperities and the renaissances that have happened within them are kind of lost, and we forget that these ancient cultures have had long, long histories before we even had geography. Right? And I think that when most Americans have never been abroad, don't have a passport, can't be bothered to watch a foreign subtitled movie even, and very often the same people who say we're number one with absolute conviction. I think my first question is, well, how would you know? This is serious, because in Washington, we're talking about building a missile shield to defend the East Coast from Iranian missiles or whatever. We already have an ideas shield. The missile shield won't work, but the ideas shield is there. And we never, when in any congressional debate have you listened to people talk about, what can we learn from the Dutch about public transportation? What can we learn from the French about their healthcare system? What can we learn from the Scandinavians about the way they raise children and treat education? No other country does anything better than we do, it seems. So we can't possibly learn from them. Having said that, I think that there are many exceptional things about this country. Revolutions tend to end badly very often. It's very rare you see successful ones that can sustain themselves over many generations. And one of the things we did well is we stuck the landing. Right? We balanced, for the most part, we balanced the separation of powers, checks and balances. We got that part more or less right. We did some oopsies with regard to race and gender, but as Noam Chomsky sarcastically once quipped, a country that's founded on the foundations of genocide and slavery can't be all bad. And Tammy Schultz, when she found out I was subbing for her on this panel, she tweeted me and says, and you have to do a David Sedaris quotation. And he said, no country has a T-shirt that says, we're number 2. But in a casual way, you might define a patriot as someone who usually thinks his or her country is in the right. And a nationalist is usually convinced of it. But an exceptionalist is certain of it, as someone only someone possessed of ignorance and arrogance can assert. Until we accept our capacity to do bad things, to make serious mistakes, even to do evil things, then we will never acknowledge our own humanity, and we will forever find other places to project that evil. And it gets us into a lot of tragic situations. There was a CNN special on U.S.-Iranian relations a couple of years ago. Christian Amanpour was narrating it. And she began by tracing the roots of our difficulties to 1979, the beginning of our problems with Iran. No mention of the CIA and the U.S.-British coup in 1953 that overthrew the democratically elected prime minister in favor of Western oil interests. And we imposed the Shah, who had a horrible human rights record. And Ayatollah Khomeini and those who came after actually outdid him in terms of horror, which is remarkable. But the idea that Iranians might be furious at us with that for decades, that we supported an incredibly repressive regime, is somehow just erased from history. The world begins in 1979 with the taking of the U.S. Embassy and the hostage situation. Right? So again, this idea of projecting the blame elsewhere at all times. Not that there isn't plenty of blame to go around. And we also think that, we mean well. Certainly our debates in Congress and stuff, we're going to spread democracy, we're going to do this and that. And that if we blow people up, if we blow up hospitals and shelters and homes and wedding parties, people won't mind as much. Our bombs are virtuous bombs. It doesn't matter as much when your family or your loved ones or your house or your pets are destroyed and mangled. And that's never been the case. The idea that the exceptionalists, when it comes to foreign policy, right? Think back to the neocons. When George Bush was running for president, there was a bit of a question about had he ever left the country. Some people think he might have visited his father when he was ambassador to China. Some people think he might have crossed the border to Mexico for a drunken weekend or something. But beyond that, I don't think it's ever been established that he's ever traveled outside the borders of the United States before running for the presidency. And that kind of, and that goes for a lot of the neocon chicken hawks and others who thought, we'll just do regime change. Saddam Hussein, he's the bad guy. We'll just chop off the head. We'll have elections. We'll screw on a new head. Presto, regime change. We'll bring democracy to the Middle East. That kind of arrogance, that kind of willful ignorance, such uncurious people about other cultures and histories. The idea that they may not relate to their system of government as simply the nation-state model that we're taught, but that your loyalties, your primary loyalties, may be first to your family, then to your clan, then to your tribe, then to your ethnicity, then to your religion, and then finally the weakest form of legitimacy is the nationalist legitimacy. And we think we'll just regime change. That's all it takes. And look at the mess we've been dealing with. We opened up a huge can of worms without understanding what kind of mess we're getting into and what forces we're unlocking. That kind of arrogance is, as a resident of Washington, D.C., I feel it from Congress, particularly the GOP these days especially. The idea that Congress is exceptional and D.C. is exceptional, that we have a larger population than Wyoming or Vermont, and yet we have no meaningful representation in Congress and certainly no senators. And we're never going to get that as long as we're 90% Democratic, in my opinion. But that Congress then gets to use D.C. as a political football because they can, because there's some clause in the Constitution which was riddled with all kinds of errors from day one, right? Still says that they have that power to oversee D.C., that we can't unelect these people. And they're going to impose their will with regard to LGBT rights, about legalization of marijuana, about abortion services, that sort of thing. And Congress will always stick its nose into D.C.'s affairs because they can, with tremendous arrogance. And that, to me, is an exceptionalist foreign policy writ large, that we do this to the rest of the world because we're so convinced and because we're so powerful and we control so many strings and we have so much clawback ability to get people to toe the line that we're going to do it. We'll do a coalition of willing if we have to, but we're going to get our way one way or another. And that, I think, is the kind of resentment that, as a D.C. citizen, I feel, in a small degree towards Congress. Imagine how it feels to be someone living in another nation having your policies impacted by U.S. foreign policy in our national interests. And so that lack of context and curiosity, I'll conclude with this. You're familiar with the Cottonelle brand of tissue paper and moistened wipes, which you shouldn't flush. But I tweeted a few weeks ago a picture of their product line. And I said, this is for Senator Tom Cottonelle, when only a complete and utter asswipe will do. That's the kind of exceptionalism I'm talking about.
Well, I'd like to ask if any of the panelists would like to comment upon or ask questions of others.
The way I used to hear what Sanjo said was, we want to rule the world. We just don't want to know too much about it. We don't want to learn too much about it. We hope it happens. But I just want to give a reflection. I had a lot of military students when I taught at the War College, and they went on to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. And I still am puzzling over how do we look at these issues. And there's certain qualities about us. A couple of us have mentioned this. We have this sense that history was yesterday, and so things that happened before don't count. We are a culture that looks forward, so we don't really look back. And we think of ourselves as problem solving, and we want to go in and fix a problem and leave. So there's certain qualities about us. But I really kept thinking about my generation. For those of you in the room who are gray-haired like me, I tried to reflect about how unique our experience was in history in terms of how we experienced it. So I was born in 45. I vaguely remember as a little girl thinking we won World War II. This was a gigantic thing. I did not remember the Depression. If this conference took place at the middle of the Depression, we would not be talking about U.S. exceptionalism in the same way. We would be struggling with the issue of the Depression. But for our generation, those of you in the room who are my age, we went through that kind of image of coming out of World War II, ups and downs certainly in life, economic growth, and then we faced three crises: civil rights, women's integration, or women's empowerment, whatever you want to call it, the advent of women in the political scene. Let's just take those two first. And so my memory when I was in college was working through those issues. Civil rights movement, people going down to the South and working on it, the women's movement working on this and seeing some consequence of this. And I think it developed in us a sense that we could take on hard issues. And obviously, after our speech this morning, we know that we still have a long way to go, especially on the race issue. But nonetheless, I think it got into us, I can just speak for myself, into me, the idea that a culture, a community can come together, take on a hard issue, and work it through. We can land, what do you go?
Stick the landing.
Stick the landing. This is an unusual phenomenon. When I lived in Saudi Arabia, I had this sense that all issues would go on for decades, hundreds of years, without being resolved. The comment we'd hear about the issue of women would be, this will take time. And when they say take time, in my mind, it's, how about next week, next year, let's get women driving, let's do this and let's do this. But in the Saudi context, and again, same thing in Asia, when I lived in Asia, time is a long experience, past the end of my life. So I just add that in terms of having that overseas experience makes you, at least made me reflect on all the little idiosyncrasies of how I approach problems. And honestly, I can't help myself. I want to fix Saudi Arabia. I can't stop myself, except for my cultural respect to say, this is a different culture. What they do for them is up to them, not up to me.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to what Janet was saying, I too am of a certain generation, and my recollection, obviously, it may be tainted by the gauzy images of time and my lack of remembrance. But one of the things that I remember that drove those who were involved in the civil rights movement in the early days of the environmental movement, those debating both for and against America's involvement in Vietnam, and a whole host of other issues, stemmed from, at least in my view, the belief that we are exceptional, therefore we are better than this. If we are exceptional, it's rooted in certain values and beliefs and principles, and therefore we cannot allow these things to stand. And the debate is not over whether or not we do better, but how we go about doing better. The other kind of point here that interestingly, it just struck me we haven't mentioned, is looking at American exceptionalism from the other angle. And particularly, I'm talking about dealing with other nations that view themselves as exceptional. If you want to get a sense of, number one, the problems that you create for others by being exceptional, but number two, how easy it is to slide into this mode, consider the current trend of Russian exceptionalism. I talk to a lot of people from places like Georgia and the Ukraine and other nations that were once part of or bordered on the Soviet Union, and they have a very real concern about what is occurring in Russia, and the discussions and the identification of the problem comes back to what we see reflected in the policies of Putin and his government that are many of the same things we've talked about here happening in Russia. So this is not a unique phenomena to America. David Sedaris said, nobody's got a T-shirt that says we're number two. There are lots of other people out there who have the number one T-shirt. And I think it's worth reflecting on what sorts of challenges, problems, and threats that creates for us that should give us pause when we embrace too quickly a too simple and all-encompassing view of our own exceptionalism.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting when you travel to another country, let's say that you travel to Saudi Arabia, and you look at a map of the world, it's really stunning. The United States is not in the center. And other countries are also exceptional. We have the things about our country that we value that have special meaning to us. I don't think that any of us would be happy if we said, well, maybe in 300 years we'll see whether or not women can go to college. Maybe in 400 years we'll see whether or not, women can vote. It took us a long time, but we have a system that enables us to make change. So our failing, if we go into a war where we should not be, which we certainly done, we had no business, in my view, in the Iraq War that started under President Bush. We had no business being there. We need to change things. We need to have a system where if a Republican president does something that is wrong, Republican members of Congress aren't going to support him just because he's of the same club. And if a Democratic president does something wrong, Democratic members of Congress aren't going to support him just because he belongs to the same club. So it's not that we don't have faults. We do all kinds of things. The great story about how people forgot where the conflict with Iran began. One of my wife's and I's good friends was the charge d'affaires in Tehran when that happened. We remember stuff that predated that, and Langan remembers stuff like that. It didn't begin then. But what we do have, if the Saudi doesn't like, the fact that women, don't have rights, tough. The king will let them know. In this country, we're the king if we take the power and use it. The problem, and I know that it has become the thing to do is to praise the millennials and how they're going to change everything, by, getting on their Facebook pages. You do it with marches and demonstrations and calling on members of Congress and being at their town meetings, and using the power of the vote and the powers of organization, mobilization that Martin Luther King used and others who making changes hard, but we at least have a system that allows us to do it if we get off our butts and do it. So that's one of the things that I think is worthwhile. And I think the point you were making about we do tend to forget this. You were talking about militarism. If you want to really change people, we should use, I don't know how many of you are among the many Americans who think we spend too much on foreign aid. We spend too little on foreign aid. We spend too little on getting out and using our ability to help people in other places, have a better life instead of bombing them. So, I agree. We got a long way to go, but we do have the means to fix it.
I would just offer 3 quick quotes to kind of frame the Q&A perhaps a bit. The first one is an old African proverb that says the person who throws the punch never remembers, and the person who receives the punch can never forget. Yeah. And we've thrown too many punches and we've received too few. We haven't really known what a war does to a country since the 1860s. And I think the second quote is from, again, the Civil War era, Ambrose Bierce, who's writing way back then. He said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. A lot of foreshadowing there. And then finally, Zhou Enlai, the former foreign minister of China, was asked by a French journalist in the 60s what he thought of the French Revolution. And he said, it's too soon to tell. Perhaps he was being snarky, but he's also right.
Well, this is the time for questions from the audience. And again, should there be students who have questions, please step to the front of the line.
Also, while you're doing this, I also make another comment about, again, images of words and what they mean to us. I remember, some of you may have heard me say this before, but on the day after 9/11, I was teaching in D.C., and I could see the Pentagon burning from my classroom. And about 2 days later, we reconvened, and President Bush had made, to me, a very moving statement at the National Cathedral about the attack, about 9/11, and about freedom. It was a lovely speech, very moving speech. And so the next day we were in seminar, and I had an officer, in addition to the American students in my class, I had an officer from the country of Oman, which is next to Yemen and south of Saudi Arabia. And we were talking about this, and this Omani officer had spent a lot of his career in the States. He's very colloquial in English. And so we were talking about the concept of freedom and our embrace of it, and I think President Bush had said something about they don't understand our freedom, or they're against our freedom. And we were talking about this, and the Omani officer said, well, I have a different image than you do of freedom. And I said, well, explain it to me. And he said, well, it's like your concept of free love and marriage, that you don't take the commitment of marriage seriously. So it's free love. Have a relationship with whoever you want to. In his mind, what he was trying to say is that in the historical experience of much of the Middle East, there's only really 2 governance models. It's either a strong authority structure, a king, a military dictator, a military leader, something that's a strong authority structure, or it's chaos. So the fear, and the reason why, if you think about Tahrir Square in Egypt, the expression happened, and a lot of us thought, oh, this is going to be a first step into embracing some kind of broader participatory activity. And nothing really followed. The Muslim Brotherhood was an organized group, but in terms of the people in the square, I realized that the ideas, the things that we chew on in this country, the ideas of history, justice, order, all these things are things that we chew on every day. We think about it. You're all here participating in this. In societies that really only see in their own historic memory authority structures or chaos, that level of reflection and debate hasn't happened yet, or it's just beginning right now. So that's a context to your question about what does freedom mean to us and what does freedom mean to them.
The gentleman over here.
Yes. Many of you said that exceptionalism is how we govern ourselves, and through seems like democratic system, like we govern ourselves by electing representatives. We aren't the only country that does it now. Many countries in the world are democratic. So how can we be exceptional if there are many examples of that happening in the world now?
It goes back to what you said.
Oh, it goes back to what I said? What did I say?
Just us.
I think we were actually talking about some of this out in the hallway, and yeah, I don't want to misquote Mickey, so I'm sure, please feel free to correct me. Yeah, there are lots of different forms of democracy. One of the problems, those of us who remember the debate in this country over the idea of democratic peace, democracies don't fight other democracies, therefore we want more democracies, was what is your N? If you have an N of 1, that's a very specific kind of democracy, that's one thing. If you have an N where there are lots of different forms of democracy, there are others. Yeah, there's democracy in lots of other countries, and there are elements of them that are exceptional on what I would consider the same level as ours. There are others that have struggled because the structure of their democracy is such, as Mickey alluded to, that your representative can essentially be appointed by the party to run for a particular district, even though they have never lived there. There are major governments, major democracies, at least one of which we consider one of our most important allies, that have been effectively been ruled by one political party for decade after decade after decade. The idea, in my view, is that yeah, democracy itself as an idea is exceptional, and it's an important ideal to defend. But it's not going to stand on its own. We've had to go back and tinker and in some cases wholesale alter democracy. What was it, 1904, before we actually elected senators rather than having them appointed by state legislatures. You know, the concept of how democracy in this country works is constantly under focus and scrutiny and adjustment. I would submit in those other countries that are democracies, and you're right, there are many of them, that have been effective democracies, have gone through that same process. There are a lot of democracies out there that put it on paper and have struggled with the ability to govern under that kind of a model, because just saying your democracy's not quite enough. I mean, there's the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, of Korea. So,
yeah, I would just add to that. It's Fareed Zakaria said it very well. I mean, it is not democracy per se that distinguishes us. It's liberal democracy. It's liberal democracy in the sense of rule of law. You know, equality before the law, things like this. You know, so even if they elected their king in Saudi Arabia to say, well, we'll let you know, whether or not we're going to permit women to do whatever, so what? I mean, that's not the kind of democracy we believe in, and that's why our Constitution has in it 2 separate forms of ways to amend the Constitution, including starting from the people up. So, yeah, I agree with Jason that just calling yourself a democracy and going to the polls, and amazingly, the guy who runs the Kremlin wins every day. It's shocking how they do that. That's not enough. That's not. Ours is different.
yeah, I would just add to that the democracy that is probably closest to our own and yet very, very different, and the one that we placed as basically as a foundation we built ourselves on. I mean, we trace our own Constitution back to the Magna Carta, is Great Britain. And yet there are an awful lot of discussions and debates that we have in this country under the umbrella of democracy that, because of the Official Secrets Act, would not happen in Great Britain. Probably the most democratic nation in Europe, and one that I think most political scientists and casual observers would place on par with us, has very severe restrictions on what we would consider, what we would expect as just routine democratic rights. Now, having said that, there are lots of problems. I mean, Mickey pointed out the problem with primary elections in this country. You have some states that have now gone to, everybody goes into the primary, and if the general election is the two Democrats who got the most votes, well, so be it. Pretty dramatic idea, kind of a fundamental change to the way we've always done things, but at least that's a movement in the direction of something more in the way of true democracy. But there's 46 other states that have yet to adopt that, so we have work to do, no question.
I think one other place we could look for some of the origins of our system of governance is the Iroquois Confederation, right, who we later crapped on. But then I think a lot of this problem can be traced back to the poverty of our political discourse. If you don't have the language to talk about these things, then it's hard to describe what alternatives might look like. The Eskimos, the Inuit, have some 24 words to describe snow, it said, right? Because snow is important. It's life or death to them. And we say democracy is important to us, and yet we have 2 words to describe democracy in this country, Democrat or Republican. And if you dare vote Green Party or Libertarian or whatever, you're viewed as some kind of a freak who doesn't get it. And yet every human society that has ever existed, from totalitarian fascism on one end to anarchism on the other end, has found a different way to organize its politics, its economics, its society, its religion. And we're not allowed to learn from any of those examples on this incredible spectrum of the human experience. We're only allowed to look at these 2 narrow points that are increasingly so close together now that Kate Moss couldn't squeeze between them. At a point where we should be embracing and expanding our definitions of democracy, we're restricting them and narrowing them, and I think that's not helpful.
The gentleman at this microphone.
I can think of 2 threats to exceptionalism that we've not talked about yet. One is an education system that is arguably underperforming, and a second of inequality. As far as a threat to our exceptionalism, how concerned are you about our education system and inequeity?
Let me start with the education system. Our education system in America sucks. I mentioned before about how it doesn't teach civics, it doesn't teach critical thinking, it doesn't teach the humanities, it underfunds all of those things. But it's more than that. So Jay referred to, in my latest book where I talk about the fact that we have these sore loser laws in 46 states. I'll give you an example. There was a senator elected from neighboring state, Utah, Mike Lee. The previous senator, Robert Bennett, who would have easily carried the Senate, would have voted very differently in the Senate. Carried the state, voted very differently than Bennett. And Lee got the votes of a convention of 3,500 people, 1/10% of the population of the state. And because he got that, Senator Bennett was not allowed to be on the ballot in November. If you want to know how Ted Cruz got to be a United States Senator in the runoff with 2% of the vote of the population of Texas, making him the only Republican allowed to be on the ballot in a Republican state. So we have really fundamental things that we need to fix. And the story about education is I've traveled the country talking about it, and I've talked to political scientists, to professors of all kinds. I've talked to journalists. Sore loser law, what's that? 46 states, including Colorado, have that kind of undemocratic law. So we have really failed in public education, in educating people to be citizens, not just earners.
I'm on a panel in a couple of days on the future of higher education and what a University of Colorado in 2035 will look like. So I'll save my wrath and venting of spleen for on that point for that panel. But I think we've hit on an important element here, and it kind of follows on to the question of the student earlier about what has happened to political parties. Bearing in mind that we're a nation that started out where the founders were absolutely vehemently opposed to even having political parties, then we kind of developed them over time. You had a period of time, especially before the Civil War, where we were changing and evolving, and the Whig Party went away and the Republican Party emerged. And for years, part of what provided a degree of democratic stability and change was how parties evolved and how they changed. Bear in mind, the party that was founded on and committed to ending slavery and inequality was the Republican Party. The environmental party, up to and including, hate to say this myself, but Richard Nixon was the Republican Party. My party, the Democratic Party, was the party of institutional racism in this country for years. But the parties themselves managed to change, to evolve, to bring in new voices, to form new consensus, to serve as a platform for evolving the broader political system. The political parties effectively now in this country, especially since Citizens United, are dead. And we haven't figured out how institutionally we're going to restructure this and provide a vehicle for doing that kind of constant evolving and changing and adapting that any democracy needs.
Gentleman in green there. In reference to women in Saudi Arabia, you said what they do for them is up to them, not up to me. But if you do believe in the idea of American exceptionalism, shouldn't you also think America should have the responsibility to stand up against injustices around the world, like the Kurdish population in northern Iraq, for example?
It's a good question, right? It's a historical dilemma. When does a country intervene in somebody else's issue, and what's a moral standard for that? So it's all nations struggle with this. The only point I was trying to make about that is that each culture has its own tradition, its own worldview. For change to happen, to address the issues within that culture, if it's not indigenous, if it doesn't stem from things that touch the heart within that culture, in other words, something coming from the outside, in history I think it shows it doesn't stick. So you can say, we're going to change this or that, but if it's not felt by the people, and I have to say, in the case of Saudi Arabia, within the context of where they are in their concept of history, of time, and if this was on a panel before because we have a Saudi participant this year, and she was here last year, the decision that the government made 5 years ago to have these scholarships for Saudi students to go overseas, to come to the United States or Europe or Asia to go to college, a full scholarship. What's significant about that scholarship program is, number one, it's based on merit. It's not based on who you know, which is a big deal, and it's not based on gender. So if a girl has the best grades and scores the best, she gets the scholarship, and you can take that scholarship on to getting a medical degree or an engineering degree, whatever you want. There's no question in my mind that the amount of women now in college, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in the Middle East in general, in Qatar right now, 75% of the student body are women in Qatar. That is going to have an impact. And so coming from within the women within Saudi Arabia, within Qatar, whatever changes they evolve are going to be lasting changes versus something that I might say as an American to say, you need to change. It makes me sound like a wife. Right? All women, you've heard me say this before, all women I know who are wives have wonderful ideas to improve their husbands. You know, honey, if you would get a little more exercise or quit smoking or whatever. Good intentioned. I don't know any husbands that say, honey, you're right. I'm going to do whatever you say. And sometimes our foreign policy to me has that quality. From our point of view, good intentioned, but it sounds, it doesn't resonate.
Yeah, there's an aspect of the end of exceptionalism that you haven't really touched on that I wanted you to, at least until Jay brought up Citizens United. But Janet, I feel like I'm from your generation, and I remember in middle school, we laughed at the banana republics because they had the rich ruling for the benefit of the rich, and they had no middle class. And gee, isn't that the direction we're going? Don't we need a Teddy Roosevelt to come back and say, you can't buy my vote?
Yeah. There's a good article, if you Google this topic, there's an article that came out in a wonderful journal, by the way, called National Journal, which we used to read every week on the Hill. And it's called The End of American Exceptionalism. And one of the things they talk about in this article was that, from the article's point of view, there were three aspects that make us unique. How religious we are, the concept that we're a religious nation, our patriotism, and the idea of upward mobility. And then the article goes through to show that we are not as religious as we imagine ourselves to be. Church attendance is down, and different explanations about that. Our patriotism, we're looking at international involvement right now, and even within the Republican Party, there's a beginning debate about interventionism and the amount of patriotic fervor we have versus the reality of what we've encountered in the world. But then the last point is your point. Have we lost the idea of the self-made person? That you have the ability, coming from humble beginnings, to achieve. I mean, honestly, my husband and my brother-in-law both grew up on a dairy farm in Georgia. They are the model in my mind of what upward mobility is. They grew up in a poor circumstance. Some would argue they still have a way to go, but I would say, they studied hard, they took advantage of things, they served their country, and they have achieved. That is the American dream. But you're right, as we look at let's say the last 10 years, that dream is becoming ever more difficult. And the gap, this is not just in our country, around the world, it's true in Mexico, it's true in China, it's true in India, it's true in Saudi Arabia. The gap between wealth and poverty is expanding. So I think it's a legitimate question.
My name's Donald Burke. I heard the words Citizens United mentioned twice a little while ago. My question to all the panel, do you think that the unlimited flow of money to our political process is seriously undermining our democracy? And if you do, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I think it is seriously undermining our democracy. And so I'm a lawyer, so I'm hesitant to say this. I don't want to get in trouble, but, I don't know what the members of the court were smoking when they passed Citizens United, but it was only legal in Colorado. And the idea that a corporation is a person could only be believed by somebody who may have passed con law classes but never took a course in corporate law, which clearly makes distinctions between, people and corporations. In my book, I actually take probably maybe even the more extreme position than anybody in this room would take, and that is, I don't think, when you go vote, there's nobody in line with you to vote except another human being, period. And so what I think we need to do, it's harder, the second part about how to get there, but what I think we need to do is have campaign funding that is limited, transparent, and only from human beings, which means no corporations, no labor unions, no PACs, no political parties, nothing but individual contributions, limited and transparent. I think that's where we need to go. I actually have a little bit of hope. I've been talking to some law firms in D.C. It's not going to be easy, but I think there are some people on the court who really are quietly, privately thinking, my God, what have we done? And if there could be some way found to get this issue back before them, they would find ways to modify that decision.
Thank you. I assume that the other members of the panel are in agreement. If not, I'd love to hear about it.
My first job out of college was working on the Hill for a man who still is my hero, and you may be familiar with the family name, Morris Udall. And my first responsibility was doing all the scud work on campaign finance reform. And one of my most vivid memories of that was how bipartisan that effort was. It was not the Udall Clean Elections Act. It was the Udall-Anderson Clean Elections Act. And the number of co-sponsors we had on both sides of the aisle was it was impressive. Now it would be kind of stunning, but it was just accepted as a matter of course. It's an issue that up until this was, this was John McCain's issue, and he was absolutely right. My only hope is that it will not take as long for the court to overturn Citizens United as it did to overturn the Dred Scott case. But I think the consequences are just about as dire. And to the person who commented that what we need is another progressive Teddy Roosevelt candidate, I would agree. There's a former Republican congressman from Oklahoma who might be available. His wife is glaring at me from the second row right now. But I'll just put that out there for you.
Your question brought to mind a meme that's going around the internet. I'll believe corporations are people when Texas executes one.
Hi, my name is Hans Miesler, and this question concerns a book that I finished reading just recently by Jack Matlock. Some of you might know him. He was the ambassador to Russia during the Gorbachev-Reagan era. He wrote a very excellent, in-depth book about what happened after the fall of the war and after our so-called victory in the Cold War. It was called Illusion of a Superpower. I'm wondering if you can address, do you think that the American government right now in the last 20 or 30 years still suffers that illusion? Is that why we went into Baghdad and some other areas?
Well, the simple answer is yes.
Was he correct?
Once I start talking on this, I will
not.
not stop. So you better start.
Open up a can of worms.
There's a general sense that power fills a vacuum. So when the Soviet Union exited as the Soviet Union from the international arena, I remember again teaching at the War College during that period, right, when between the end of the Cold War and then let's say before 9/11, and it was clear that we were searching for a role. And so there were people in the NGO community raised the issue of humanitarian intervention, and that became Rwanda, the various crises situations that came up. The liberal part of the international community began to say, "Aha, we need to do something." Even Madeleine Albright, that famous quote about what's the use of a military if you don't use it. So you develop that school, and then honestly, you have to acknowledge that. Not only is, and this goes back to our experience in the Depression and World War II, I think there is a basic acknowledgement that federal spending stimulates growth. Now, you can do federal spending on roads, you can do federal spending on a lot of different things, but federal spending on defense, military equipment, things, creates jobs. And I think the combination of that reliance, that over all these years, that reliance on this, plus the absence of the Soviet Union, these humanitarian crises, as well as the notion that we are a power. We think of it as we are power to bring stability. And my argument about this to my friends in the military is that, and in the Foreign Service, is that while all that those are all factors, that going back to something we've all been talking about today, our lack of depth of understanding about the regions in which we want to get involved, you would think would temper this. But that involves a depth of understanding. And so what we're talking about here is, in the role of world power, does that not require a degree of responsibility in that role? So you can
Anybody
talk about
else?
Russia.
Yeah. No.
No, Ukraine.
I'll just say, by way of example, and I think to your point, when I first started teaching American politics to young cadets at West Point back in the 80s, we would have a lesson where we talk about, okay, what constitutes national power? What are the elements of national power? And these young 18, 19, 20-year-olds would say, well, military power, which you'd kind of expect them to say, and then go on to other things. What I found is very interesting. I am now teaching senior officers who are, many of them, out of that generation that I once taught as young cadets, who are now colonels, generals, senior diplomats, etc. And when I ask that same question, military power comes in somewhere around 6th or 7th. There is a growing awareness among those who are in the arena dealing with foreign policy and this definition of a superpower, that national power is a multi-element process, that other nations actually were more aware of this than we were, and that if you are only thinking of your power in terms of your military, and you're not thinking in terms of economics or diplomacy or public health or education or social structure or labor or political mobility or environmental concerns and on and on and on and on, then you've failed the test of adequately defining what is power, and you probably shouldn't be wielding it.
Thank you.
One last question.
As an aside, the court turned down the opportunity to review Citizens United with Montana, but now maybe more time has passed. But my question is about manifest destiny, and it seems to me that what we're talking about today is the son of manifest destiny, which is that we're better. I'm going to agree with Zanjo, and it allows us to justify doing things that decent people wouldn't do, like in that case genocide, for example, and robbing Mexico. You know, Lincoln spent a long time in the desert because he made that speech about Polk's war that was viewed as anti-patriotic. We did a lot of things that decent people wouldn't do, but we were exceptional.
We need a question.
And so, is it the son of manifest destiny? And how do we, it's like every culture, every primitive, if to use that word, their name for themselves tends to be translated as the people. And we all tend to be narcissistic about our country
we need a
and
question
stuff.
here,
How
please.
can we avoid this? That's my question.
You know, sure, there are people who think that way. They're a tiny group. They make a lot of noise. You know, you have people who get on the airwaves and they get a lot of coverage and all that. But there is not a very large number of people in this country who believe that we have a manifest destiny right to just sweep in and brush other people aside and bomb them and all. Those decisions have been made by some people in power, and we didn't stop them. But that's not. We're not a country that says we have a manifest destiny. I think that's there's a fringe, that may believe that. That's not a dominant point of view in my opinion.
And also, I think one of the interesting things in this upcoming presidential primary race, especially in the Republican Party, is I anticipate that these related issues are going to be debated. If Rand Paul continues, if he becomes a candidate, I haven't seen much polling on this. I would be really curious to know what our polling information is showing about the inclination of Americans now for further war. I don't know. So but one barometer of it is, if the Republican primary is a contested issue, a vibrant part of democracy, a lot of candidates, step up. They're not going to say things that they don't feel will get a response. And so I'm going to be looking carefully, actually, at the Republican primary season to see how do these folks, what are they hearing? They're doing polling themselves. I'm really, really curious to see where they are. Just as an example of this, one of my good friends from a long period of time, he used to work for Senator Helms, has become very, very anti-war. Now he's doing it for budget reasons. He's a conservative Republican in the old traditional way that Republicans were tight-fisted with money. And he sees this as an unending expenditure. And so I'm going to watch with interest on how the Republican primary develops over these next months.
Your question reminded me of George Bush's address to the nation after September 11th. And the two takeaway points was, go out and spend money, because there was afraid the stock market would collapse, and we needed to get the economy going, and report suspicious behavior. And so I went on my computer and did some little crude photoshopping, and I came up with this. This is how I interpreted it. It's Uncle Sam saying, I want you to shop and behave. And I think, enough with the shopping already, and don't behave. Start questioning. I think it's time for us to become protagonists in our own future. Because if we don't show up, someone else is showing up.
I'd like to thank our panelists for a really wonderful discussion, and thank you all for coming out. And there are 4 more days of this.
No way. No way. First of all, my wife would kill me. And not only that, but she would both.